Cabin dust doesn't settle without reason, Hank Lawson muttered under his breath as he stared at the spotless hearth for the third time that morning. The flame danced against freshly polished boards, reflecting no trace of the soot Hank was certain had caked them just yesterday. He reached out to brush a fingertip across the mantel. It came away clean. But let's go back to where it all began. 3 days earlier, Hank Lawson rode into Cedar Ridge with nothing but a broken wagon wheel and a bit of pride to spare. A former marshal turned recluse, he'd retreated from the world after a botched chase left him questioning every shot fired and every life lost. His cabin, perched on the edge of the pines, was a fortress of silence. Dust on windowsills, cobwebs in corners, and an unspoken barrier to any who dared cross its threshold. That afternoon, Hank paused by the general store, hat in hand, boots worn thin. He needed help, though he'd never admit it to another soul. Mrs. Whitaker, the storekeeper, looked up from stacking kerosene lamps. "You seeking work, Mr. Lawson?" He cleared his throat. "Actually, ma'am, I'm looking for someone to tidy my place. Been too long without company or help." He kept his voice neutral, but his insides churned. Pride made him clench his jaw at the thought of admitting need. Mrs. Whitaker's eyes softened. "I know just the one. She's new to town. Quiet girl, honest. Cleans every place until it shines." She tapped the ledger with a gnarled finger. "Name's Clara Bell. Lives on the North End. I'll send her your way at dawn." That night, Hank lay awake on his bunk, listening to the forest breathe through the cracked window. Dust motes swirled like will-o'-the-wisps in the lantern light, mocking him for his solitude. He told himself it was just a cabin to clean, no harm in dusting off the past. Yet somewhere in his chest, an old wound throbbed. The echo of a shot fired too late, the silence of a partner's final breath. To first light, Clara Bell arrived. She wore a simple calico dress, apron tied neatly at her waist. Her steps were sure on the uneven boards. She carried a bundle of cloths and a bucket of soapy water, her dark hair pinned back in a plain braid. Hank watched from the doorway, surprised by the poised strength in her posture. "Morning, Mr. Lawson," she said, voice gentle but firm. "You'll be pleased when I leave." She nodded once and stepped inside. For hours, he heard the steady swish of cloth on wood, the scrape of broom against floorboards, the faint hum of a song he couldn't place. Something hopeful, almost sacred. He stayed on the porch, clearing brush, stealing glances at the transformation unfolding behind glass panes. Each sweep revealed grain in the walls, warmth in the hearth, and light in a place he'd long forgotten could welcome it. By midday, the cabin glowed. Clara stood on a crate to polish a high beam. Her slender arms reached into shadows and coaxed out hidden splinters of gold. Hank felt a tug of wonder. How could someone restore more than a room? How could a stranger stir echoes of life in a man who'd sworn silence? When she stepped down, Clara paused by the hearth. She looked around, taking in the details: an old photograph on the mantel, a pair of boots drying by the door. Her gaze lingered on the rifle propped against the wall. Hank's hand twitched. She met his eyes without flinching. "Boots outside, rifle inside," she said softly, as though reading a code he'd long stopped understanding. Hank nodded. Words stuck. "Thank you." She finished her work without another word, gathered her tools, and slipped out the door into the late afternoon sun. Hank stepped forward. "A fair wage waits," he said, producing a few coins. Clara accepted them without looking. "Thank you, sir. I'll return tomorrow." He watched her go, Cape of Pines drifting behind her like a silent promise. The cabin felt different. Less like a tomb, more like a heart beating again. But Hank couldn't shake a flicker of unease. She'd cleaned more than dust. She'd touched something inside him that feared scrubbing away every trace of human warmth. That night, sleep eluded Hank. He rose and walked the dark path to town, retracing Clara's footprints in the dew-soaked grass. Each step brought questions. Who was this woman carving light out of shadows? And why did their encounter feel less like a transaction and more like fate knocking at his door? The next morning, Hank waited on the porch. Clara appeared at dawn, basket in hand. Not cleaning tools, but a loaf of fresh bread and a small jar of honey. Her eyes held no awkwardness, only calm. "Thought you'd like breakfast," she said, offering the gift. He swallowed. "You didn't have to." Her smile was brief, honest. "I want to." She lifted her chin and turned, ready to continue her work. "Where shall I start?" He hesitated, then guided her to the loft, where dust lay thick as tumbleweed. As she climbed, Hank surveyed her from below. Boots worn but sturdy, dress clean yet stained by honest labor, braids swaying with each deliberate step. When she raised her arm to dust the rafters, the morning sunlight caught in her hair, and for a heartbeat, the cabin held its breath. Hank found himself drawn into the rhythm of her work, sweeping, polishing, arranging hearth tools with careful precision. Clara hummed that same quiet tune, notes weaving through the rafters, binding them in a shared hush. He realized he hadn't heard a single word of gossip from the saloon, or the preacher's prayers pounding in the church. Instead, the cabin resonated with something deeper, the sound of two strangers discovering they needed each other's presence. By midday, Clara packed her tools. She paused on the threshold, looking at Hank with eyes that seemed to hold untold stories. His heart thudded, fear and anticipation interlaced like horses' reins in a storm. What if this simple work led to revelations Hank wasn't ready to face? She spoke at last, voice steady. "I finish tomorrow. Then I'll come to your door, if you still need me." Hank nodded, but his gaze lingered. "I'll need you." The words surprised him, as if he'd spoken them in his sleep. Clara inclined her head. "I'll be here." That night, Hank gathered his courage. He cleaned his boots by the fire, each stroke of the rag meticulous. He removed the photograph from the mantel, a picture of a partner he'd lost, smile frozen in black and white, and placed it gently in his coat pocket. Tomorrow, he'd ask Clara the questions he dared not ask himself. Who was she? What drove her to Cedar Ridge? And why did her presence illuminate every dusty corner of his solitude? Outside, wind rustled the pines. Hank pressed his palm to the window, tracing Clara's silent silhouette against the dawn. He didn't yet know the truth he would uncover when he followed her home, but as the first light of sunrise filtered across the plains, he felt the stirrings of destiny in his chest. And at the edge of that stirring, he knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow would change everything. He thought about the warnings he'd heard in town, that Clara Bell was no ordinary housekeeper, that she'd wandered into Cedar Ridge chasing debts of her own, and that a man who hired her might find secrets sweeping through his life worse than any dust. Still, he looked into her determined eyes as she scrubbed the back stairs, shoulders straight, dark braids swinging, and felt a pull stronger than caution. That afternoon, Hank Lawson sat on his porch with a jug of whiskey and a canvas bag at his feet. He'd watched Clara tidy the kitchen until the copper pots gleamed like new moon. He'd heard the quiet hum of her song, the light scrape of her broom. Now he took a measure of courage, too late to turn back. He rose and stepped into the cabin, closing the door against the dusty light outside. Clara stacked her cloths by the hearth. When she turned, her expression was open, expectant. "I have something to ask," he said, voice low. Her brows rose. "Sir." He unknotted the canvas bag, revealing a battered brass locket, etched initials faded by time. Inside, a tiny portrait, a young woman, smiling bravely. Hank's fingers trembled as he held it out. "She's my sister. Died 10 years ago before I came west. I've never had her things cleaned, polished. It's all I have left." Clara set down her cloths and accepted the locket reverently. In her hands, the brass warmed, tarnish melting away as she traced the delicate engraving. "She's beautiful," Clara whispered. Hank swallowed. "I want you to take her memory somewhere she'd be safe." And then, he paused. Had he gone too far? "Then maybe you can stay a bit longer. Help me keep this cabin and my life from falling apart." Clara lifted her gaze, cheeks pink from the hearth's warmth. "I'll do my best," she promised. Word spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire in dry grass. By dusk, the general store was buzzing. Mrs. Whitaker held court behind the counter. I heard you asked Clara to do more than clean, she said, eyes narrowing. Don't go digging into ghosts, Mr. Lawson. Hank bristled. What do you know of ghosts? Mrs. Whitaker leaned closer. More than you think. She's got a past. Ran from a man who swore a debt, a promise broken in blood. Folks say she can wipe away dust, but can't escape her own. Hank tipped his hat, heart thudding. He rode back to the cabin wondering whether he'd made a terrible mistake. Clara met him at the door, the locket clutched like a fragile bird. That was my grandmother's promise, she said softly. She said this locket would guide me home. Hank closed the door and watched the dusk settle. He'd sworn to protect Clara from her past. Now he realized she'd unearthed his own. The cabin's clean floors felt like freshly swept judgments. No hiding place for secrets. That night, Hank lay awake listening to the wind slipping through the logs. Clara's soft humming drifted from the loft. He thought about her promise, his own, and the cost of mercy. Tomorrow, the townsfolk might come knocking, asking whether he'd ruin his reputation for the sake of a stranger's sorrow. But as the moonlight filtered over his rifle and the locket beside his bed, Hank's decision solidified. Some debts demand repayment, and some kindnesses demand sacrifice. He would stand by Clara no matter the price, because in saving her, he might finally save himself. The dawn found Cedar Ridge cloaked in pale mist, the world hushed as if listening for an answer. Hank sat on his porch, rifle across his knees, watching the trail that led to Clara's cabin north of town. His heart pounded with uncertainty. He'd tracked her here, drawn by something he couldn't name, yet terror gripped his chest at what he might uncover. Clara stepped onto her porch as he arrived, the locket gleaming at her throat. Her hair caught the morning light, a dark halo against chipped white paint. She laid a hand on the railing and offered him a small, tentative smile. "Thank you for coming," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Hank nodded. "You didn't have to show me this place." She turned, sweeping a glance over the ragged fence and the lean-to Clara called home. "It's not much, but it's mine." Hank rose and stepped across the yard. "I should have asked sooner. He swallowed. "I found debt collectors in town. They're looking for you." Clara's smile faltered, replaced by a steel glint in her eyes. "Then I'll face them," she said, chin high. "I won't run again." They crossed the threshold together. Inside, dust motes drifted in shafts of light. Clara guided him to a narrow table where a rough ledger lay open. Entries of labor traded for debts, dozens of names crossed out in faded ink. At the bottom, Clara had written a single line, "Paid in full, Clara Bell." Hank ran a fingertip over the words. "You earned your freedom here." She looked away, eyes on a cracked mirror above the stove. "I thought earning it meant owning this cabin. But owning it doesn't stop the past from calling." Hank set his rifle against the wall. He approached her slowly, careful not to startle. "Then let's answer that call." She turned, breath-catching. "What do you mean?" He took her hand. "I'll stand by you. All of us," he said, nodding toward the ledger. "We'll show them you've already paid what you owed." Clara's lips trembled. "They won't believe it." Hank tugged her gently toward the door. Outside, the fog had lifted, revealing a knot of riders approaching, dusty, grim-faced men with the hollow look of pursuit. Clara stiffened, fear flickering across her face. "Stay behind me," Hank murmured. The riders halted where the path split, lanterns bobbing in early light. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man named Wallace Briggs, stepped forward. His eyes were hard slits, his jaw set. "Clara Bell," he called, voice echoing. "You owe Samuel Klein 5 years of labor." She drew a breath, shoulders squared. "No one owes him anything," she said, voice trembling but resolute. Wallace spat. "Your ledger says otherwise. We have his signature." Hank crossed his arms. "I have the ledger too." He pulled it from his coat and held it aloft. "Signed, paid in full. Witnessed by town council, and by every person whose name you see crossed out." Wallace frowned, stepping back. One of the riders muttered under his breath. Clara stepped beside Hank, voice stronger now. "My work paid every debt. This cabin is my proof." A murmur rippled through the men. Wallace looked at Hank, then at Clara. After a tense heartbeat, he lowered his gaze to the ledger, scanning the lines. The writers exchanged glances as if weighing profit against shame. Finally, Wallace folded his arms. "If you say it's paid, we'll take it up with Klein. But we're done here." He turned his horse, and his men followed, spurs clicking as they melted away down the trail. Clara exhaled, relief flooding her features. Hank slid an arm around her waist. "You won." She leaned into him, warmth blooming in her chest. "Thanks to you." They watched the riders disappear, and the world exhaled with them. Crows took flight, a dog barked in the distance, and the sun broke free of a cloud cover, bathing the cabin in gentle light. Later that afternoon, the porch creaked as neighbors arrived. Mrs. Whitaker with fresh bread, Jonas from the saloon clutching a jug of cider, even Samuel Klein himself, hat in hand and eyes shadowed by regret. He approached Clara slowly, removing his hat as he neared. "I'm sorry," he said, voice thick. "I buried your freedom in ink and threats. You didn't deserve it." Clara squared her shoulders. "My father didn't deserve it. But I forgive you for carrying out debts that weren't mine." Samuel nodded, tears shining. He reached into his coat and produced a small envelope. "This was meant for Mr. Lawson, proof of the debt's transfer. I never sent it." He pressed it into her palm. "It names me liable for Klein's claims. I hope it brings you peace." Clara unfolded the paper. Named in black type, "Samuel Klein accepts full responsibility for the contractual debt of Clara Bell." She looked up, gratitude mixed with something like disbelief. Leaning on Hank's arm, she stepped forward. "That's more than I expected." Samuel offered a sad smile. "Your work taught me something. Kindness is worth more than any ledger." He turned and walked back to his horse, mounting in silence. The neighbors watched as he rode off, and a weight lifted from the tight knot of community judgment. Clara folded the letter and tucked it into the locket's pouch. She clicked it shut and held it against her heart. Hank slipped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. As dusk settled, lanterns lit the windows of every cabin on the ridge. Neighbors drifted by Clara's porch, laughing children, a trio of women trading recipes. The preacher hobbled on crutches to offer a blessing. Hank and Clara sat side by side, hands entwined, surveying the warmth they'd helped restore. The final rays of sunlight painted the pines in gold. Clara leaned her head on Hank's shoulder. "My cabin was cleaned," she whispered. "But you helped me clean my soul." Hank tipped his hat toward the horizon. "And you helped me find a reason to open my door." They watched night descend, each star a promise that debts forgiven and kindness repaid could outshine any darkness. In that quiet stillness, two souls, once shattered by past mistakes, found peace in a cabin made bright by honest work and an unwavering choice to stand together. And at last, the door that froze Hank's heart when he followed her home swung wide, welcoming both of them into a future cleansed by truth and bound by love. By the time the moon rose over Cedar Ridge, the world had settled into a hush that wasn't quite sleep. A gentle peace born of truths laid bare. Hank Lawson stood on his porch, the rifle he'd carried all day leaning against the rail, forgotten now. Inside, Clara Bell moved quietly through the cabin, tending the oil lamp's wick and straightening a stray rag rug. The place felt more like home tonight, walls warmed by laughter and candid confessions instead of dust and half-spoken regrets. Hank stepped inside, boots light on the polished boards. Clara paused at the hearth, hands folded against her apron. The locket at her throat caught the lamplight, glowing a soft brass. She looked at him with a calm confidence he'd never seen when they first met. "They're gone," she said simply. Hank crossed to her and took the locket in his hand, turning it gently. "Your debt's paid. Your father's sorry. The debt collectors are on their way out of town for good." Clara's smile was quiet, but it lit the room more effectively than any lamp. "And Mrs. Whitaker's offered me more work. She needs someone honest now that word's spread. I can help at the store, earn real wages." Hank set the locket on the mantel beside the photograph of his sister. "You deserve more than work or wages," he said, voice shaking with feeling he didn't quite trust. "You deserve a choice." She turned, eyes reflecting the small fire in the hearth. "I know." Her hand brushed his, slender fingers curling around his calloused ones. "And I choose you if you'd have me." He swallowed hard, heart pounding in his ears. All the loneliness of the past 10 years pressed into that moment. Every dawn he'd watched alone, every bottle he'd emptied in the company of ghosts. Now, here stood the woman who'd polished life back into his cabin and his heart. "I'd have you," he said, voice thick with relief. He drew her close, resting his forehead against hers. "I already do." Outside, a dog barked in the distance, and a warm breeze threaded through the open window. They stood there a long while, two broken souls leaning into each other's shadows, finding that together they cast a stronger light. Later, when Clara slipped into the loft to tuck away her cleaning tools for the last time, she paused by the window. Moonlight spilled onto the floorboards, and there, scrawled in hushed letters on a scrap of paper pinned to the wall, was her ledger entry, "Paid in full, Clara Bell." Beneath it, Hank had written, "Welcome home." She fingered the words and felt a soft tear slip free. This cabin, once a tomb of regret, had become her sanctuary, and his promise. Morning found them riding together beyond Cedar Ridge. Clara atop Ember's mare, Hank on his sorrel, side by side along the dusty road. They carried no weapons, only the quiet courage born of yesterday's confrontations and confessions. Their destination was the general store, where Mrs. Whitaker waited with open arms, and the church's steps, where Reverend Smith would offer a blessing for new beginnings. As they entered town, neighbors paused in doorways, tipping hats and offering smiles. Children ran out, waving. At the store, Clara turned a neat row of jars on the shelves, humming that same hopeful tune as she had while scrubbing Hank's cabin. Today, though, the tune felt like hers alone, not borrowed from the wind. Hank lingered by the doorway, watching her, seeing her not as the frightened stranger who'd collapsed on his porch, but as a partner in life's next chapter. He lifted his hat when Mrs. Whitaker approached. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving her a place to stand." Mrs. Whitaker patted his shoulder. "She's been a blessing to the whole town," she replied. "And well, you did right by her. Cedar Ridge is a better place for it." Later that afternoon, Hank and Clara stood outside the little church. A handful of townsfolk gathered, Jonas from the saloon, Reverend Smith with a Bible under his arm, even Samuel Klein and Anna's father, now reconciled and offering their congratulations. The preacher stepped forward and spoke of mercy, redemption, and the unforeseen ways kindness reshapes a community. When it was over, Hank slipped a plain iron band onto Clara's finger. She slipped his sister's old locket around his neck. They exchanged vows, simple, unadorned promises spoken in the same language Clara had once thought lost to her. No grand ceremony, no fancy dress, just two hearts laid bare before friends and strangers alike. As sunset bled gold across the pines, they walked from the church hand in hand. Ember and the sorrel followed, tails swishing in contented rhythm. Beyond the town lay uncharted horizons, fields yet unsown, skies yet unexplored, but together, they felt ready for whatever came. At the cabin that evening, they lit every lamp they owned. Clara set flowers on the table, wild daisies from the ridge, picked at dawn. Hank replaced the photograph on the mantel, leaving the locket beside it. Then they settled into the rocking chairs on the porch, shoulders touching, watching the first fireflies of summer wink alive between the pines. In the distance, a train whistle sang its lonesome call, but this time, the sound carried promise, not sorrow. Hank drew Clara closer and whispered, "Nothing settles here again without reason." She rested her head on his shoulder and smiled. "Let's make sure it's always the right reason." And as the night deepened, two hearts opened to the steady pulse of home, clean, bright, and bound by love stronger than any debt or fear. Bennett Ridge quieted into sleep, its debts forgiven and its doors forever wide.